Officer Vance Harlan tightened his grip on the quiet black woman's arm, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he prepared to humiliate her in front of the entire courthouse. "People like you don't belong in this wing," he hissed, assuming she was just another vagrant or troublemaker who had wandered past the security checkpoint. He shoved her through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B, ready to play the hero for the gallery. But as he proudly announced his catch, he didn't realize he had just crossed the one woman holding the fate of the entire city in her hands. And the judge, presiding over the room, was about to unleash a storm of karma he would never forget. The Oak Haven County Courthouse was a towering, imposing structure of gray stone and marble, built in an era when architecture was meant to intimidate. On a rain-soaked morning, the corridors were a chaotic symphony of clicking heels, hushed legal strategies, and the occasional sob of a broken family. For Imani Brooks, the chaotic atmosphere was just background noise. Imani was a senior structural engineer at one of the state's most prestigious civil engineering firms. She was brilliant, meticulous, and completely unfazed by intimidating environments. That morning, she had been awake since before dawn, crawling through the damp, structurally compromised underbelly of the city's massive suspension bridge. She had been hired by the city itself to investigate a multi-million-dollar corruption case involving a massive construction conglomerate that had used subpar materials on public infrastructure. Because she had rushed directly from the dangerous site inspection to the courthouse, Imani wasn't dressed in a crisp designer suit. She wore a pair of dark, heavy-duty denim jeans, steel-toed boots, and a beige trench coat that bore a faint smear of rust and industrial grease near the hem. Her thick, natural hair was pulled back into a simple, functional bun, and she looked visibly exhausted. Imani made her way to the third floor, the restricted wing reserved for judges, high-profile witnesses, and senior legal counsel. She held a gold-embossed visitor's pass, issued directly by the district attorney's office, clipped onto her belt, though her trench coat currently obscured it. Finding an empty wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, Imani sat down, opened her heavy leather briefcase, and began reviewing complex schematics, waiting for the bailiff to call her in. "Enter Officer Vance Harlan." Harlan was a veteran of the courthouse security detail, a man who treated the municipal building less like a public institution and more like his own personal domain. Standing 6'2" with a broad chest and a permanently scowling face, Harlan had a well-documented, though frequently swept under the rug history of excessive force and racial profiling. He believed he possessed a sixth sense for trouble, which usually just meant he harassed anyone who didn't fit his narrow, prejudiced view of what a respectable citizen looked like. As Harlan strolled down the third-floor corridor, his thumb hooked aggressively into his utility belt. His eyes locked onto Imani. To Harlan, the restricted wing was a place for men in expensive suits and women in tailored pencil skirts. What he saw was a black woman in muddy boots and a dirty coat sitting on a bench meant for the city's elite, casually flipping through papers. He didn't see the complex engineering blueprints in her hands. He didn't see the gold-embossed DA pass hidden under her coat. He only saw someone he decided, in a split second, did not belong. "Hey!" Harlan barked, his voice echoing sharply down the marble hallway. Imani didn't look up immediately. She was entirely engrossed in a load-bearing calculation that proved the corrupt contractor had knowingly risked thousands of lives. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Harlan snapped, closing the distance between them with heavy, authoritative stomps. He stopped just inches from her boots, looming over her to maximize his physical intimidation. "Are you deaf? Put the papers down." Imani finished jotting down a quick note in the margin of her blueprint, capped her pen, and finally looked up. Her expression was neutral, completely devoid of the fear or subservience Harlan usually commanded. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice calm and remarkably steady. "The question is, how did you get up here?" Harlan demanded, his eyes raking over her attire with blatant disgust. "This floor is restricted. It's for court personnel, attorneys, and authorized parties only. The public waiting area is on the first floor next to the cafeteria. I am aware of the building layout, officer, Imani replied, holding his gaze. I am an authorized party. I'm waiting for the session in courtroom 4B to begin. Harlan let out a harsh, mocking bark of laughter. Right, and I'm the mayor of Oak Haven. Look, lady, I don't know if you slipped past the lobby checkpoint or if someone left a stairwell door propped open, but you need to pack up your little drawing project and head back downstairs before I decide to cite you for trespassing. Imani let out a slow, measured breath. She had dealt with men like Harlan her entire life. Men who underestimated her, men who tried to bully her, men who let their prejudices dictate their actions. She wasn't going to let a power-tripping security guard disrupt a case she had spent months building. Officer, Imani said, her tone dipping into a dangerously cold register, I suggest you check your manifest for the day. My name is Imani Brooks. I am completely within my rights to sit on this bench. Harlan's face flushed a deep, angry red. He despised being spoken to with authority, especially by someone he had already deemed beneath him. I don't need to check a damn thing. I know every attorney and expert that walks through this wing, and I don't know you. Now get up. I will not, Imani said simply. The air in the hallway grew thick with tension. A passing paralegal slowed her pace, casting a nervous glance at the brewing confrontation before hurrying away, unwilling to get involved. Harlan, realizing his authority was being openly defied, felt his temper snap. He stepped closer, invading Imani's personal space, his hand resting menacingly on the handcuffs at his waist. Listen to me very carefully, Harlan growled, his voice dropping to a gravelly, threatening whisper. You are going to close that briefcase, stand up, and walk to the elevator. If you don't, I will drag you out of here in cuffs, and I promise you, you will spend the night in a holding cell. Imani carefully closed her briefcase, ensuring the clasps locked shut. But instead of standing, she leaned back against the wooden bench. Officer, you are making a profound mistake. If you arrest me, you will be interfering with an active, high-stakes municipal trial. I strongly advise you to walk away. The sheer audacity of her calm warning completely short-circuited Harlan's ego. In his mind, she was being aggressive and non-compliant. Show me your ID, he demanded abruptly. Imani reached towards her trench coat, intending to pull the DA's VIP pass from her belt. Keep your hands where I can see them, Harlan suddenly shouted, his voice booming down the corridor, artificially escalating the situation to make it seem as though he were in danger. Do not reach inside that coat. Imani froze, her hands hovering in the air. You just asked for my ID. It is clipped to my belt underneath my coat. I said keep your hands visible, Harlan yelled again. Several administrative doors cracked open down the hall, faces peering out to witness the commotion. Harlan was playing to his audience now, establishing a narrative of a hostile, uncooperative suspect. Stand up, turn around, and place your hands on the wall. Imani did not move. She knew the statistics. She knew how quickly a simple misunderstanding could turn lethal when an aggressive officer decided he felt threatened. She kept her voice perfectly level, enunciating every word for the benefit of the onlookers. I am unarmed. I am an expert witness for the prosecution in the State versus Lang construction. My name is Imani Brooks. I am sitting peacefully. You are escalating the situation unnecessarily. Last warning, Harlan barked. When Imani still refused to yield to his unlawful order, Harlan lunged. He grabbed her left arm with brutal force, his thick fingers digging painfully into her bicep. With a violent jerk, he hauled her to her feet, knocking her heavy leather briefcase off her lap. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, scattering a few loose index cards. Hey! Imani yelled, her calm finally breaking as a sharp pain shot up her shoulder. Take your hands off me. You have no right. Resisting an officer, Harlan announced loudly to the empty hall, twisting her arm awkwardly behind her back. You're done, lady. You're going straight to holding." Imani struggled, trying to plant her feet, but Harlan outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds. He pushed her forward, forcing her to march awkwardly down the corridor. Her steel-toed boots slipped on the polished marble. "This is assault," she protested, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. "You haven't even checked with the bailiff." "I don't need to check with anyone." Harlan sneered directly into her ear, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. "I run security on this floor. I say who stays and who goes, and trash like you goes." He didn't march her toward the elevators. In a twisted display of dominance, Harlan decided he wanted to humiliate her properly. He wanted the court staff to see him doing his job, to see him taking out the garbage. Courtroom 4B was located just 30 feet away. Harlan forced Imani toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. "Officer, stop," Imani warned, her voice trembling slightly from the pain in her shoulder, but carrying an undeniable weight of impending doom for the man holding her. "If you open those doors, you are going to destroy your own career. This is your final warning." Harlan just laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Shut up." With his free hand, Harlan reached out and pushed hard against the brass handles of the courtroom doors. They swung open with a heavy, dramatic creak, revealing a packed gallery. Courtroom 4B was a grand, cavernous space lined with dark mahogany and bathed in the dim, solemn light of frosted glass windows. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, city officials, and legal aides. The case of the city of Oak Haven versus Lang Construction was the biggest civil litigation the county had seen in a decade. Millions of taxpayer dollars and potentially criminal negligence charges hung in the balance. At the front of the room, seated behind a massive elevated wooden bench, was Judge Naomi Vale. Judge Vale was a legend in the local judicial system. A fierce, uncompromising woman in her late 50s, she was known for her razor-sharp intellect and her absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics or incompetence. She was currently in the middle of addressing the defense counsel, adjusting her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose when the heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Every head swiveled toward the back. There stood Officer Vance Harlan, chest puffed out in a posture of exaggerated authority, firmly gripping the arm of a black woman in a stained trench coat. Imani's face was taut with anger and pain, her arm still pinned awkwardly behind her back. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," Harlan boomed, his voice carrying an unearned pride. He began to march Imani down the center aisle, directly past the rows of stunned journalists and murmuring lawyers. "I caught this individual loitering in the restricted wing. She was uncooperative, refused to produce identification, and resisted commands. I'm removing her from the premises and taking her down to holding." Harlan expected nods of approval. He expected the bailiff to rush over and assist him. He expected the judge to thank him for maintaining the sanctity of her court. Instead, the reaction was absolute paralyzing horror. At the prosecution table, the lead district attorney, Marcus Hale, stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair tipped over and crashed to the floor. The color completely drained from his face. "What in God's name are you doing?" Marcus shouted, abandoning all courtroom decorum as he scrambled around his table. Harlan blinked, halting halfway down the aisle. "Securing the area, Mr. Hale." She was out in the hall. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of Judge Naomi Vale's gavel striking the sound block was like a sequence of gunshots echoing through the mahogany room. The sheer violence of the strikes made Harlan jump. "Officer Harlan." Judge Vale's voice was dangerously low, a soft, lethal rumble that carried to the very back corners of the gallery. "Release that woman's arm instantly." Harlan hesitated, genuine confusion washing over his face. "Your Honor, she's a trespasser. She was exhibiting erratic behavior. And if you do not remove your hand from her person in the next 2 seconds," Judge Vale interrupted. her eyes flashing with a terrifying fury. "I will hold you in contempt of court, and I will have my bailiff place you in handcuffs. 1, 2. Harlan dropped Imani's arm as if it were coated in acid. He took a stumbling step back, his hands raised defensively. Imani immediately stepped away from him, rubbing her bruised bicep. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her coat, her composure returning with chilling speed. She looked directly at the judge. "My apologies for the disruption, Your Honor," Imani said clearly. "I was attempting to wait peacefully in the corridor as instructed." Marcus Hale finally reached Imani, looking utterly frantic. "Imani, my God, are you hurt? Did he injure your shoulder?" "I'll live, Marcus," Imani replied quietly. Harlan looked back and forth between the high-powered district attorney and the woman in the muddy boots. A cold, heavy stone of dread began to form in the pit of his stomach. "Mr. Hale, you know this woman?" Marcus turned to Harlan, his expression venomous. "Know her? You ignorant fool. This is Imani Brooks. She is the lead structural engineer from the State Oversight Committee. She is our primary expert witness. Without her testimony, this entire multi-million-dollar case falls apart." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The journalists in the back rows immediately began furiously scribbling on their notepads. Harlan's jaw went slack. The blood rushed out of his head, leaving him dizzy. He stared at Imani, then at her muddy boots, trying to reconcile the image of the woman he had just assaulted with the title of a state-appointed elite engineer. She didn't look like. She didn't have ID," he stammered, the arrogant bravado entirely stripped from his voice. "I tried to show him my DA-issued VIP badge, Your Honor," Imani interjected smoothly, pulling back the lapel of her trench coat. The shiny gold badge, clearly identifying her as an essential party to the court, gleamed in the overhead lights. "Officer Harlan informed me that if I reached for my ID, he would assume I was reaching for a weapon. He then forcibly grabbed me and dragged me into this room." Judge Vale removed her glasses. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. "Bailiff," Judge Vale called out, her tone dripping with ice. "Yes, Your Honor," the burly courtroom bailiff replied, stepping forward quickly. "Please escort Officer Harlan to the front of the bench and stand very close to him." Harlan felt his legs turn to lead. As he walked toward the elevated wooden desk, he could feel the burning stares of every attorney, journalist, and city official in the room. He had marched Imani down this aisle to humiliate her, but the walk of shame was entirely his own. He stopped before the judge, swallowing hard. "Your Honor, it was a misunderstanding. Standard security protocol. You can never be too careful these days." "Silence!" Judge Vale snapped. She leaned over the bench, glaring down at Harlan. "You have been a stain on this courthouse for years, Officer Harlan. I have seen the complaints filed against you. I have seen the whispers of your blatant profiling and your aggressive, power-hungry tactics. The administration may have protected you in the past to avoid a scandal, but you have just assaulted a state official in the middle of the most important trial in this county's history." "Your Honor, please." "I said silence," she roared. "You saw a black woman in working clothes sitting quietly in a hallway, and your immediate instinct was to physically assault her and parade her in here like a trophy. You are a disgrace to that uniform." Judge Vale turned her gaze to the district attorney. "Mr. Hale, is your witness physically capable of testifying today?" Marcus looked at Imani, who nodded firmly. "She is, Your Honor." "Good," the judge said, turning back to the terrified cop. "Officer Harlan, surrender your badge and your service weapon to the bailiff immediately." Harlan's eyes widened in panic. "Your Honor, you can't fire me. I have a union. I have rights." "I am not firing you," Judge Vale said, her voice dropping back to that terrifying, calm rumble. "I am stripping you of your courthouse authority, effective immediately. but that is the least of your problems." She looked over at the prosecution table. "Mr. Hale, as the district attorney for Oak Haven County, did you just witness an unprovoked physical assault and unlawful detainment of a state employee?" Marcus Hale straightened his tie, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips. "I certainly did, Your Honor, along with approximately 60 other witnesses." "Then I expect you to file criminal charges against Mr. Harlan before the sun goes down," Judge Vale declared. "Bailiff, take this man out of my courtroom. If he sets foot in this building again without a lawyer, arrest him." As the bailiff stepped up and placed a heavy hand on Harlan's shoulder to strip him of his gear, Harlan looked back at Imani. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smirking. She was simply looking at him with the cold, analytical gaze of an engineer who had just watched a faulty, corrupt structure finally collapse under its own weight. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B clicked shut behind the disgraced officer, but the charged atmosphere inside the room lingered like ozone after a lightning strike. Judge Naomi Vale took a slow sip from her water glass, her expression smoothing back into a mask of judicial impartiality. She looked over at the prosecution table. "Mr. Hale, if your witness is ready, let us proceed. I will not allow the ignorance of a single ousted security guard to derail months of municipal work." Marcus Hale nodded, gesturing to the witness stand. "The state calls Imani Brooks to the stand." As Imani walked past the low wooden gate and raised her right hand to be sworn in, the jury and the gallery watched her with a newfound, profound respect. The muddy, steel-toed boots that Harlan had found so offensive now served as undeniable proof of her dedication. She had literally just crawled out of the trenches to protect the city, only to be attacked in its halls of justice. For the next several hours, Imani dismantled Lang Construction's defense brick by brick. Using the very blueprints Harlan had demanded she put away, Imani explained load-bearing physics, material degradation, and structural stress. Her voice was steady, her intellect piercing. She demonstrated exactly how the conglomerate's CEO, Victor Lang, had authorized the use of Grade 3 steel instead of the mandated Grade 1 on the city's primary suspension bridge, pocketing the difference to the tune of $8 million. When the defense attorney, a slick, high-priced lawyer named William Gallagher, attempted to rattle her on cross-examination by questioning her methodology, Imani didn't flinch. "Mr. Gallagher," Imani replied calmly, leaning into the microphone, "the tensile strength equations are completely unambiguous. If you look at Exhibit C, page 42, you will see the stress fractures are already propagating. The math does not lie and it does not discriminate. If the city does not reinforce those pylons within the next several months, a catastrophic failure is mathematically guaranteed. Your client traded human lives for profit margins." The jury shuddered. Gallagher had no rebuttal. Meanwhile, 3 floors down, in the basement of the courthouse, Vance Harlan was experiencing a very different kind of reality check. He was sitting on a cold steel bench in holding cell number 3, the exact cell he had gleefully promised to throw Imani into just an hour prior. Stripped of his duty belt, his badge, and his radio, he looked smaller, deflated, and thoroughly pathetic. The heavy iron door swung open, and Gary Thompson, the veteran union representative for the courthouse police, stepped into the room. Gary looked exhausted, holding a thick manila folder under his arm. Harlan stood up quickly. "Gary, thank God. Tell me you've got this sorted out." Vale completely overreacted. The woman looked like a vagrant. It was a good-faith mistake. "Get me out of here, and let's get the union lawyers on this." Gary didn't move to open the cell. He just stared at Harlan through the bars, his expression a mix of pity and disgust. "Sit down, Vance," Gary said flatly. "I don't want to sit down. I want my badge back." "Your badge is currently sitting in an evidence locker at the district attorney's office," Gary replied, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And the union is not backing you on this." Harlan froze. "What? You have to back me? It's in the bylaws." The bylaws protect officers acting within the scope of their duties, Gary corrected, opening the folder and sliding a piece of paper through the bars. You violated roughly 6 different departmental policies in the span of 5 minutes. You bypassed the checkpoint logs, initiated physical contact without provocation, ignored a direct statement of identity from a state employee, and then paraded her into a courtroom in front of a sitting judge, the DA, and 60 members of the press. Harlan stared at the paper. It was a formal notice of indefinite suspension without pay and criminal charges. Channel 7 News already has the story, Gary continued relentlessly. Cynthia Ross is doing a live broadcast from the courthouse steps right now. They're calling it the Muddy Boots Assault. The mayor's office is fielding calls from civil rights groups. The engineering firm Imani Brooks works for is threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the precinct, and Marcus Hale is out for your blood. It was a mistake, Harlan yelled, his brazier's voice cracking with rising panic. It was a power trip, Gary shot back, and you picked the absolute worst person in the state to pull it on. Hale's office just filed the preliminary paperwork. They are charging you with third-degree assault, false imprisonment, and official oppression. You're looking at real prison time, Vance. You need to call a private defense attorney because the union is officially washing its hands of you. Gary turned and walked out of the holding area, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind him with a resonant, terrifying clang. For the first time in his long career, Harlan was completely alone, and the full weight of his actions was finally crashing down on him. The swiftness of Harlan's downfall was shocking, but the universe was not quite done with him. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of poetic irony that no one could have predicted. In the days after the courthouse incident, the trial against Lang Construction concluded its discovery phase. Thanks to Imani's impenetrable testimony and the mountain of evidence her team had gathered, Victor Lang's defense was crumbling. Realizing they were facing a total loss and extensive prison time, several mid-level executives at the contracting firm began to turn state's evidence in exchange for plea deals. Late one evening, Imani was sitting in the district attorney's conference room, alongside Marcus Hale and a team of forensic accountants. They were sifting through a newly acquired hard drive, a secret digital ledger, handed over by Lang Construction's terrified chief financial officer. "This is the slush fund," Marcus muttered, rubbing his temples as he scrolled through rows of encrypted spreadsheets on the projector screen. Lang was paying off building inspectors to look the other way when they swapped the steel grades. But look at these smaller payouts. Thousands of dollars doled out bi-weekly under the heading Site Security Contingency. Imani leaned forward, her analytical mind immediately spotting the pattern. They weren't just paying off the inspectors. Look at the dates, Marcus. These payments perfectly align with the nights Lang Construction was moving the stolen high-grade steel out of the municipal holding yards to sell on the black market. They needed the local beat cops and security details to turn a blind eye. Exactly, Marcus agreed, his eyes narrowing. They bought off law enforcement. We just need to decrypt the recipient IDs. One of the forensic accountants typed furiously on his keyboard, running the decryption keys the CFO provided. Now it should replace the alphanumeric codes with the actual names on the payroll. The screen flickered, the column shifted, and suddenly a list of 24 names populated the screen. Most were low-level security contractors or corrupt overnight dispatchers. But as Imani's eyes scanned down the list, she stopped dead. She pointed a pen at line 147. "Marcus," she said quietly, "look at that name." Marcus Hale leaned closer to the screen. The blood drained from his face, replaced quickly by a predatory, incredulous smile. There, plain as day, was the name Vance Harlan, Oak Haven Courthouse Division. Next to his name was a ledger of monthly payments spanning 3 years totaling over $85,000. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus whispered. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating clarity. Officer Vance Harlan wasn't just a racist, power-hungry bully. He was on Lang Construction's illegal payroll. His job had been to ensure that any paperwork detailing the movement of materials through the city's legal system, or courthouse evidence lockers, was quietly misplaced. "This changes everything," Marcus said, standing up and pacing the room with sudden electric energy. "When Harlan saw you in the hallway, Imani, do you think he knew who you were?" Imani thought back to the encounter, the raw arrogance, the dismissive sneer. "No," she said firmly. "He didn't recognize me. If he knew I was the lead investigator on the Lang case, he would have avoided me, like the plague to protect his own skin. He targeted me, purely because of how I looked. He thought I was an easy target to bully, to make himself feel big." Marcus laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "That is the definition of poetic justice. By letting his bigotry dictate his actions, he forcefully dragged the lead investigator of a corruption ring directly into a courtroom, making a massive public spectacle of himself. If he had just left you alone, we might never have looked closely at his specific finances. He would have just been a name buried in a spreadsheet of 200 people. But because he assaulted you, your office is already fully investigating his life, his communications, and his bank accounts for the assault trial." Imani finished, realizing the magnitude of the twist. "Exactly." Marcus grinned, picking up his desk phone. "I'm calling the FBI. This just crossed state lines into federal racketeering and bribery." The following morning, Vance Harlan was sitting in the sterile office of his newly hired, incredibly expensive defense attorney. They were discussing strategy for the upcoming assault trial, trying to figure out how to paint Imani as uncooperative to mitigate the damages. "We lean heavily into the security angle," his lawyer was saying, adjusting his silk tie. "We argue post-9/11 vigilance. It won't clear you, Vance, but it might keep you out of a jail cell and just get you probation." Before Harlan could nod in agreement, the heavy glass doors of the law firm were shoved open. Harlan turned around to see Marcus Hale walking in, flanked by two stern-faced FBI agents in dark windbreakers. "Mr. Hale, this is highly inappropriate," Harlan's lawyer sputtered, standing up. "My client is represented by counsel. You cannot approach him without an appointment." "I don't need an appointment to execute a federal arrest warrant," Marcus said smoothly, holding up a piece of paper, signed by a federal judge. He looked directly at Harlan, whose face had gone chalk white. Vance Harlan, one of the FBI agents, stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for federal extortion, bribery, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in connection with Lang Construction." Harlan's legs gave out. He collapsed back into his leather chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. The sheer impossibility of it all shattered his mind. He had thought his career was over because he shoved a woman in a hallway. He had no idea his entire secret life of corruption had been dragged into the light. "How?" Harlan choked out, his hands trembling as the FBI agent pulled his arms roughly behind his back, the exact same way he had pinned Imani's arm just days prior. "You did it to yourself, Vance," Marcus Hale said coldly, stepping aside so the agents could march him toward the door. "You couldn't stand the sight of a black woman sitting quietly in your hallway, so you dragged her into the spotlight. Turns out, she was the one holding the flashlight. Have a nice life in federal prison." The transition from a cocky courthouse kingpin to a federal inmate broke Vance Harlan in less than 48 hours. He was denied bail. The federal prosecutor, a ruthless and meticulous woman named Serena Holt, successfully argued that a corrupt police officer with ties to a multi-million-dollar racketeering syndicate posed a severe flight risk. Harlan was placed in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Detention Center, ostensibly for his own protection as a former cop. But the isolation only amplified his unraveling mind. The media circus surrounding the Muddy Boots cop exploded into a national scandal. It was no longer just a story about a racist security guard having a meltdown. It was a sprawling tale of civic betrayal. Investigative journalists dug into Harlan's past, unearthing dozens of previously buried complaints from minority citizens who had been harassed, detained, or assaulted in the courthouse corridors. The Civilian Oversight Committee, emboldened by Marcus Hale's aggressive stance, reopened every single case. But the true drama unfolded months later in the mahogany-paneled chambers of federal judge Everett Lang. Harlan, having lost 40 pounds, his hair thinning, and his skin sporting the gray pallor of prison life, sat silently beside his exhausted public defender. He had run out of money for expensive private lawyers weeks ago. The prosecution's star witness for the day was none other than Victor Lang, the billionaire CEO of Lang Construction. In a desperate bid to shave a decade off his own 60-year sentence, Lang had agreed to testify against everyone on his payroll, including his street-level enforcers. "Mr. Lang," Prosecutor Serena Holt began, pacing slowly before the jury box, "could you explain to the court the specific function Officer Vance Harlan served for your organization?" Lang, wearing a baggy orange jumpsuit that made a mockery of his former billionaire status, leaned into the microphone. He didn't even look at Harlan. To men like Lang, Harlan was just a discarded tool. "Harlan was our bottleneck," Lang testified, his voice raspy. "Whenever we needed to transport substandard steel through the city's inspection checkpoints late at night, or when we needed certain structural reports to disappear from the municipal archives, Harlan made sure the path was clear. He manipulated the security cameras, coordinated patrol schedules, and intimidated junior clerks. We paid him $5,000 a month in cash." Harlan dropped his head into his hands. It was over. The audio recordings, the encrypted ledgers, the bank deposits hidden under his brother-in-law's name. The FBI had found it all. But the final nail in the coffin belonged to Imani Brooks. When Imani was called to the stand to testify regarding the assault and the timeline of the corruption discovery, the courtroom fell completely silent. She was no longer wearing the muddy boots and stained trench coat. Today she wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, her posture impeccable, radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. "Ms. Brooks," Serena Holt asked gently, "on the morning when Officer Harlan assaulted you, did you have any suspicion that he was on Lang's payroll?" "No," Imani replied cleanly, her voice ringing out in the cavernous room. "I was there, solely to testify regarding the structural failure of the Oak Haven suspension bridge. Officer Harlan's intervention was entirely unprovoked and driven by his own prejudices. He made a visual assessment of my race, my gender, and my work attire, and concluded I did not belong in a place of power." Holt nodded. "And what was the result of that prejudice?" Imani allowed herself a small, icy smile, her eyes finally locking onto Harlan's broken form at the defense table. "The result was that he dragged me, the lead investigator, who was actively searching for a missing link in the corruption chain, directly to the very people capable of prosecuting him. By trying to humiliate me, he handed us the exact thread we needed to unravel his entire criminal enterprise." The jury actually murmured in awe of the sheer poetic karma of it. Harlan couldn't even meet her gaze. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of profound regret and self-pity leaking down his cheek. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Judge Everett Lang's voice was devoid of mercy as he read the verdict. "Vance Harlan, you took an oath to protect the citizens of this city. Instead, you preyed on the vulnerable. You lined your pockets with blood money, and you actively facilitated a conspiracy that could have resulted in the deaths of thousands of commuters. You are a disgrace to the badge you once wore." The sentence was staggering. For the assault, false imprisonment, official oppression, federal extortion, bribery, and racketeering, 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the federal marshals clamped the heavy steel cuffs onto Harlan's wrists, he looked back at the gallery one last time. He wasn't looking for his union rep. Gary hadn't spoken to him in months. He wasn't looking for friends. He looked at Imani Brooks. She didn't gloat. She just watched him go. A quiet observer of a structure that had finally collapsed because of its own rotten foundation. In the years that followed, the dust had settled over Oak Haven. But for inmate number 84729-054, the nightmare was a daily looping reality. Vance Harlan sat on the edge of a thin, lumpy mattress in the special housing unit of a high-security federal penitentiary nestled in the bleak, unforgiving mountains. His cell measured exactly 6 feet by 9 feet. The walls were painted a dull, institutional gray that seemed to absorb the meager light leaking through the narrow, frosted slit of a window. Because of his former status as a law enforcement officer, and a disgraced one whose corruption had made national headlines, general population was considered a guaranteed death sentence. To keep him breathing, the Bureau of Prisons mandated 23 hours a day of complete, agonizing solitary confinement. The silence of the SHU was deafening, broken only by the occasional echoed screams of other broken men and the heavy metallic clack-clack-clack of the guards' boots during hourly counts. As Harlan stared at the cinder-block wall, a young corrections officer named Pike paused outside his reinforced steel door. Pike was 25, built like a linebacker, and carried himself with an air of absolute, unquestioned authority. "Chow time, Harlan. Step back from the door," Pike barked, his voice muffled but sharp through the heavy steel. Harlan complied. His shoulders slumped. He had lost over 50 pounds since his arrest. The arrogant, broad-chested bully who used to terrorize the courthouse corridors was gone, replaced by a hollow, graying shell of a man. As Pike slid a plastic tray of lukewarm, unidentifiable food through the narrow metal slot, Harlan cleared his throat. "Officer Pike," Harlan rasped, his voice weak from disuse. "The heating vent in here is broken. It's freezing at night. Can I please get an extra blanket or just put a work order in?" Pike stopped, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, a posture Harlan himself had struck 1,000 times. Pike looked at Harlan through the small pane of reinforced glass, his eyes entirely devoid of empathy. "You don't make the rules in this wing, Harlan. You get what you're issued. Sit down and eat your food before I decide you're refusing a meal, and take the tray back." The slot slammed shut with a vicious, ringing finality. Harlan stood frozen. The phantom pain of his own karma washed over him. The dismissive tone, the blatant power trip, the refusal to see the person in front of him as a human being. It was a perfect, devastating mirror of how he had treated Imani Brooks on that fateful morning. He had built his entire career on making people feel small, and now the universe had placed him in a concrete box where he was the smallest man in the world. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Oak Haven, the sun was shining brilliantly over a city that had been dragged back from the brink of catastrophe. The salty breeze off the bay whipped through the crowd gathered at the base of the Oak Haven Municipal Suspension Bridge. The massive structure, once a ticking time bomb of compromised, subpar materials, now gleamed with freshly painted cables and fortified, certified Grade 1 carbon steel pylons. The city had successfully sued Lang Construction into absolute oblivion, recovering $82 million in stolen public funds and seized assets. Standing on a raised dais adorned with red, white, and blue bunting, Imani Brooks looked out over the sparkling water. She was no longer wearing the stained trench coat and muddy steel-toed boots that had so deeply offended Harlan. Today she wore a tailored navy blue suit, though she stubbornly kept a bright yellow hard hat resting on the podium in front of her, a nod to the grueling groundwork that had saved thousands of lives. Following the explosive trial, the state governor had completely restructured the city's public works sector. Realizing they needed someone with unimpeachable integrity and a lethal eye for detail, they had appointed Imani as the director of the newly established Independent Infrastructure Oversight Commission. She now commanded an entire division of engineers, forensic accountants, and independent inspectors. "Nervous?" a familiar voice asked. Imani turned to see Marcus Hale stepping onto the dais beside her. The former district attorney had ridden the wave of the Lang construction bust all the way to the state capitol. He was now the acting attorney general. "Not at all, Marcus." Imani smiled, adjusting the microphone. "Numbers don't make me nervous, and neither do crowds. Though I do prefer being under the bridge rather than on top of it." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at the massive crowd of journalists, city officials, and local citizens. "It's incredible, Imani. Every time I drive over this bay, I think about that morning in courtroom 4B. I think about how close we came to losing everything if you hadn't been in that hallway. And the ultimate irony." Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Do you know what the state decided to do with the $85,000 we seized from Harlan's offshore slush fund?" Imani raised an eyebrow. "I assumed it went into the general municipal restitution pool." "Nope." Marcus grinned, a predatory, satisfied gleam in his eye. "I personally petitioned the judge to reallocate those specific seized funds. As of yesterday, Vance Harlan's dirty money has officially been used to endow the Oak Haven Integrity Grant, a fully funded 4-year university scholarship exclusively for minority women entering the field of civil engineering." Imani literally stopped breathing for a second. The sheer, unadulterated justice of it was staggering. The racist, corrupt cop who had assaulted her to keep her out of a place of power was now permanently funding the education of dozens of women just like her, paving their way into the very rooms he had tried to block. "That," Imani whispered, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face, "is the best thing I have heard in years." The mayor stepped up to the microphone, tapping it to quiet the cheering crowd. After a brief introduction, highlighting the resilience of the city, he turned and gestured to Imani. As she walked to the podium, the applause was deafening. Imani looked out over the sea of faces, her eyes locking onto a group of young students from a local high school who had been invited to attend the Engineering Marvel's reopening. "Integrity is not an abstract concept," Imani began, her voice steady, powerful, and echoing out over the bay. "It is not just a mathematical equation used to measure the tensile strength of steel, though that is certainly important. Integrity is a daily, deliberate choice. It is the choice to look at a system, whether it is a suspension bridge carrying 80,000 cars a day or a legal system carrying the weight of civic justice, and demand that its foundation be true." She rested her hand on the yellow hard hat. "For years, a rot was allowed to grow in this city, a foundation built on prejudice, greed, and the arrogant belief that power meant avoiding accountability. But structures built on lies will always mathematically fail. When we choose to build our systems on transparency, respect, and truth, they become impenetrable. We didn't just rebuild a bridge today. We ripped out the rotten framework of our local institutions, and we rebuilt the trust of Oak Haven." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of a woman who had refused to be broken, standing victorious over the empire of men who had underestimated her. Back in the suffocating darkness of the federal penitentiary, the 10 p.m. lockdown alarm blared, and the main breaker abruptly cut the lights to the SHU block. Vance Harlan lay on his thin mattress in the pitch black, pulling his scratchy, inadequate blanket up to his chin to ward off the biting chill. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. It never came easily anymore. Instead, his mind spooled up the exact same memory that tortured him every single night. He saw the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B. He felt the grip he had on Imani Brooks's arm. He remembered the exact moment Judge Vale's gavel cracked like a gunshot, shattering his reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. If he had just walked by, if he had just checked his own toxic ego, if he hadn't let his blind bigotry dictate his actions, he would be a wealthy, free man. But he had chosen to bully a black woman in a muddy coat, dragging her into the light, entirely unaware that she was the architect of his total destruction. The bridge in Oak Haven stood stronger than ever, designed to last a century. Vance Harlan's life, however, had collapsed, completely buried beneath the crushing, inescapable weight of his own actions. What an absolutely incredible story of justice served. Vance Harlan thought he was untouchable, preying on people he deemed beneath him. But he messed with the wrong engineer on the wrong day. The sheer irony that his own arrogant prejudice was the exact thing that exposed his massive criminal enterprise is the definition of a hard karma hit. Imani Brooks didn't just win. She completely dismantled a corrupt empire, using nothing but her intellect and unshakable composure. If you loved hearing this story of ultimate poetic justice and a bully getting exactly what he deserved, please hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves a satisfying karma story. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our deep dives into real-life drama, legal twists, and everyday heroes standing their ground. Let us know in the comments below what you thought of Imani's epic courtroom moment.